Welcome to Take a Closer Look, a podcast by Squiz. We invite today's digital leaders to share their most epic wins and, of course, the failures that taught them their biggest lessons. So join us to ditch the jargon and get real. Come take a closer look, or as the Australians say, take a squiz. Joyce Peralta, thank you so much for joining me on the Take a Closer Look podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
So at the moment, Joyce, you are Manager of Digital Communications at McGill University, and you're based out in Montreal in Canada. Now, I know that a lot of people will have seen you or heard you speaking across the speaker circuit across North America and Europe. But for anyone who hasn't heard you speaking or hasn't met you before, tell us a bit about just you and I guess your role and a bit about the university itself as well.
Well, Montreal is located in Canada in a French-speaking province. So we're an Anglophone university in a French-speaking province. It's one of Canada's oldest universities, and a lot of our prime ministers have come from McGill. We have some really well-known artists like Leonard Cohen and William Shatner from Star Trek. Is also from McGill. So historically, I think it's seen as one of Canada's more elite universities. We like to joke and say Harvard is the McGill of the US. I've been working at McGill now for 10 years. And prior to working at McGill, I worked at 3 other universities, all of them in different provinces. So I worked first at Western University in Ontario and also at King's University College, which is actually an affiliate college of Western. And then I went out to the West Coast in BC and worked at UVic, the University of Victoria, before arriving here at McGill. So I've been in higher education now for about 20 years and have been creating sites for about 30 years altogether. So I've been working in this industry for a little while. The team that I work on at McGill is the team that we define the digital standards and the design standards for the university. And we create a lot of resources and training and tools to help people align with those standards. In the areas that I am mostly involved in are related to governance and user experience.
Did a good job of getting that all in a nutshell. And there's so much I want to dig into. Before we do, it's always nice to really understand who our guests are at a bit of a deeper level. So how would your friends and family describe you? And does that differ at all from how your colleagues might describe you? Are there different parts of your personality that show up at work as opposed to outside of work?
You might have picked up from my talking about my work history. I've moved a lot. And throughout my career, I changed positions a few times. So I think that connects to my personal life in terms of I do a lot of traveling and have lived in different places. And I think that because of that, people see me maybe as being somewhat adventurous. And I think that shows up in how I approach my work, and that I'm always kind of interested in exploring new things and looking into the new developments and seeing how things work. And I think having that experience has also made me really adaptable both in terms of my personal life, but also in terms of my work environment and how I conduct, the way that I approach different projects and work with different people and different teams.
I think we're hearing that a lot as well with everyone that we interview. Everyone's kind of seeing that sort of blurred line much more these days between the person they are at work and the person they are at home, often because when they're at work and they're at home, they're in the same place. And also just because there is that kind of level of communication, I guess, in a professional setting that you might not have always had previously where, work was work and you were kind of a different, more professional person in that environment. I think we are encouraged to bring our real selves to work these days, which is great. And who is it that you have been inspired by along the way? I guess both professionally and personally. Is there anyone in particular that, as you've moved through your career, has really inspired the way that you've handled things?
I feel like one of the people that I've always looked up to and I feel has really impacted my life directly, but also the world in general, I think is Tim Berners-Lee. I think Tim Berners-Lee is an amazing person. I feel like had he not made the decisions that he made to be the person that he is, we would be living in a very different world right now. He is the person that I think was instrumental in creating this digital reality that we have now, the internet, and
Yeah.
what a big impact that's had on our society. And I have immense respect for the way that he stuck to his ideals and made things start in the way that they started, and continues to influence how we conduct ourselves in a good way online. So he is definitely a person that I've always looked up to, both personally again and at work.
Yeah, it's quite mind-boggling to imagine a world without Tim Berners-Lee, I guess, but where we hadn't ended up with the connectivity that we've now got. And obviously it's evolved massively over time, but without that sort of introduction to it, yeah, it's very difficult to imagine the world today without that. And actually on that note, so you mentioned briefly there at the beginning about the kind of the journey that you've taken through the different institutions that you've worked with. And I know that when we've talked previously, the internet and websites has been a huge part of that pretty much the whole way through. So I'd love to just hear a bit about your career journey and yeah, how that's been such a huge part of it.
I feel really lucky that I came to work with the web at the time that I did. I think when I was graduating, looking to graduate from university in the mid 90s, the economy wasn't so great at that time. I think that there's a lot of similarities to where things are at these days. There wasn't a lot of opportunities for young people, and there were, a very small number of career paths that were open because a lot of those jobs were taken up by, a very big generation that was really kind of steering how our world was going. And then the internet started
Yeah.
happening. At that time, I had decided that I was interested in music and I really wanted to work with music. And so the first thing that I decided to study was audio recording technology. And I got a college diploma, and I had intended to work with music. And one of the first jobs, actually the first job I got when I graduated, was recording bands. I don't know if you have Bell in Australia and New Zealand, telephone Bell Communications.
Oh
So the
yeah.
telephone company in Canada, they had an internet television pilot project in the mid 90s called Bell Community Express. And they were looking at creating an internet television, basically. There was a small pilot project at this time. The internet wasn't quite what it was. Not all homes had computers at that time. So they sent these keyboards out to connect to the internet. And the idea was you were going to connect to the internet through your television, and your television would be your interface to the internet. So they had this idea that in addition to all of the things they wanted to include on this product, and they were looking at things like being able to make it possible for people to bet on games as they watched sports games, for example, or have conversations about shows that they were watching. And one of the things that they wanted was they wanted people to be able to download and listen to music. So they hired me for this local pilot project to record bands in the city that I was living in. So I recorded these bands. And when we were finished recording the bands, they asked if I could make the web page that people would download the music from. And this was the mid 90s. So the speed of internet connection at that time and the types of technologies that we were using online did really facilitate. So they asked me to make this web page, and I created an interface. It's funny because to me, it kind of drives home the point of how much we were thinking about the internet from as being part of our physical world. I created a web page that looked like a cassette player. And you can imagine back then, I coded most of my web pages when I was working with websites at that time. So that was my initial introduction to working with websites. It opened up a lot of doors for me because at that time, there weren't a lot of people that had experience working in websites. You couldn't study to become a web professional in university. So from there, I just started into my web career. And it was a few years after that that I started working at my first university, which was the University of Western Ontario. So yeah, that was the start of my career.
I imagine that was a bit of a superpower because, like you say, it's not, no one else was being trained in this stuff and you were kind of thrown into it. And probably at the time you're thinking, how on earth am I going to figure this out? But because you did, you had this sort of, yeah, as I say, superpower that so many other people had no idea about. and you'd already built something that people were kind of just still trying to get their head around. The cassette player thing made me laugh because I think, yeah, it's just a classic example of, you're mirroring the UI, I guess, that someone's used to. How do they interact with something to play music? Obviously, they understand a cassette player, and it makes perfect sense. And it's a lovely little nostalgic throwback as well, isn't it? And so you mentioned that kind of getting then into the HE space, and I can only begin to imagine how much the web landscape has changed over time since you've gone through the different institutions. So I guess in those early days, what did it kind of look like at that point?
It was really a very loose collection of people in the institution who had decided to get together and try this internet thing out. So it was a collection of people who were faculty members or students or staff members who had just decided they were going to create a web page for their department. And then when I started working at Western, we had our homepage, which was really simple, and also some high level central pages like alumni relations and student services. And these teams had their own web teams that they worked with. So
Right.
centralization wasn't a huge thing. So the idea of having a standard look and feel, even a template that had a common, a common base was not something that was considered, let alone a content management system. So
Yeah.
when I first started, there was no real consistency. I feel like it wasn't until, I think maybe the earlier mid 2000s that I started working on projects to think about how can we make this information more consistent, and implementing things like templates, looking into implementing or introducing content management systems, thinking about having a common look and feel across all websites. That was something that for me started in the early 2000s, and I think it progressed throughout the 2000s. And then in the later 2000s, that's when I started thinking and working with user experience and thinking about user experience. It was something that was new at the time. I think that there were certainly established people that were established in the UX industry that, for example, Steve Krug's book, I think came out in 2000. Takes a little bit longer, I think, for things to kind of permeate into higher education. So yeah, 2008 was around the time that I started doing user research exercises, like doing usability testing and card sorting and exercises like that. I actually went back to school in 2006 to study information sciences so that I could learn more about user experience techniques. And then we started thinking more about putting users first in our work. I think before that, it was a little bit more of a kind of, you get together with your project team. If you even were going to work with a project team, maybe I'd be just sitting at a computer and I think, oh, I'll put these menu items on this website. I sometimes tell this story. When I worked at King's University College, I did almost everything at that university. I rolled out the first template that was consistent across their websites, but I also wrote content and took pictures and
Wow.
did just a little bit of a mashup of all these different tasks that are today are things that, specific people work. One of the funny stories I have from that time is I had a digital camera. So I didn't have to take pictures and scan them in. I had a digital camera and it had floppy disks that you had inserted floppy disks into
Oh,
it.
wow.
I remember if I was lucky, I could get 4 pictures on a floppy disk.
The generation coming through now don't even know what a floppy disk is. It's quite a weird, again, a funny throwback to even try and explain it is quite strange, quite abstract these days, isn't it? It's really interesting hearing you talk about how you went back to study the sort of UX side of things. I kind of feel like you almost went full circle because you were doing it intuitively in the early days. You were kind of doing it in a way that, made sense to you in terms of you want to build something that's kind of familiar for people and that they want to engage with. But then you kind of came to this point where you felt like you needed to study it to understand it better. It's like you were almost leading the charge in the first place. But I love hearing that story. Do you think as well, so hearing obviously you talk about the different institutions you work for and how things kind of changed over the time as you worked for them, Was there any kind of consistencies or similarities, I guess, between each of the institutions in how they were operating, or were you introducing new ways of thinking that you were learning from each time you entered a new institution? Because you kind of say, I've seen us solve this problem before in this space, so I know that we could do the similar thing here.
I will say, I think because I was growing my career at that time where people were moving into content management systems and they were starting to think about having consistent design across all their websites, that there were a couple of universities that I worked at where I was brought in specifically to come up with some kind of standard process for bringing sites into whatever platform, whatever template was being used, or whatever standardized process. So I feel like that kind of grew and developed over the years, though. The first time I was brought in to do a job like that, all I did was I created a little handout, a checklist of things to do if we were going to launch a project and start working on a project. And it was very simple. I think it was maybe 10 steps. And now we have a whole, we have our digital governance standards, we have a governance framework, we have a design playbook. We have all kinds of more detailed resources. But at that point, it was just this little checklist of 10 things we needed to do to build a new website. So yeah, that's kind of progressed and grown over the years. And I think those kinds of processes have evolved at all universities. We all have different ways of managing, governance and making sure that we build the best possible sites. In our institution, there's many different approaches. Some of them involve more control or training or providing resources for governance or creating communities of practice. There's lots of different ways to do things, and it depends on the institution you work at, but I think those things are evolving over time.
Yeah, that's the beauty, isn't it, of having been across different institutions and recognizing those similarities and be able to share your own learnings, share when things have possibly not gone to plan, so you know how to tackle them again a different way in another time. You mentioned as well, obviously, that when you were kind of first building websites, you were doing it all by yourself. You were doing every role. And now there is multiple people doing all of those separate roles. And I think the other thing that all organizations struggle with, not just in the higher education space, is that divide between the sort of more marketing led side of things and the more technical IT side of things. And again, kind of, I guess, the stakeholder management, but the project management as well across the two departments. Is that something that you've seen in the institutions that you've worked for? And how do you overcome those sort of two, not necessarily overcome, but how do you manage that, the two sides of the coin, from the technical team who will want to do things in their particular way and a marketing team who might want to do things slightly differently?
This is a really good topic, I think, to talk about it. It's one of the things that I feel has been consistent across all the universities that I've worked at, is the dynamics of this relationship. And I've seen a range of success, I guess, in terms of how successful these relationships are. One of the positions that I actually left because the relationship was so bad that it just created an environment that it was not a good environment to be in. But on the plus side, I think the thing that's kept me at McGill for as long as I have, and it's the reason why I feel that we've been able to accomplish so much, is that we have such a healthy relationship between our two teams. And it wasn't like this necessarily when I arrived. It was that kind of bad relationship where there was not good communication. We didn't have shared goals and objectives. We had, I think, different ideas about where we wanted to go, and maybe a lack of trust in each other's abilities and competencies. But through working on our relationship and coming to a place where we now have shared processes, we have shared goals and objectives, and we present as a unified front to the university. We don't present as two different teams. We present as one team.
Yeah, great.
And I think that has been such a great experience, because the two of us together have been able to accomplish so much that I don't think would have been possible without having this close connection. I've talked about this at some universities. I used to do a presentation with the head of our IT team, the developer team who develops our content management system, about how bad our relationship used to be and where it is now. And it was called Shake Hands with the Developer, was the name of the presentation.
I love it.
And it was about how bad things were in the dark days, and then how we were forced, basically, because we came to a point where it was so bad that it was looking like we were going to possibly take our web infrastructure and divide it in two. That's how bad it had gotten. We were thinking about splitting up our sites into two different groups that we would have managed separately. So we would have duplicated our infrastructure, our support resources, and our training. And luckily, we got some new leadership that came into the university at that time, and they said, wait a minute, this isn't a good idea. Rather than doing this, dividing the network in two, why don't we look at revamping the content management system and revamping the processes and the support and the relationships that are connected to the content management system. And that's when we started to work together to develop user research practices, to define our governance together, to create our digital standards. And a lot of the things that we have today, our design system, our processes for working together to develop our content management system, that comes out of those experiences of, thinking about how can we work together better.
There is light at the end of the tunnel for anyone who's facing that challenge at the moment. You've just got to find the way to make it work, I guess, both from a relationship perspective, so being able to communicate, but also, like you say, from a tech perspective, you've got to make sure you've got the right platform and the right processes in place to make sure it's actually feasibly possible for you to both be able to operate in an environment that works for both the marketer and the developer. And I'm kind of skipping around a bit here, but just thinking about the governance piece. So obviously, a lot of what you're talking about, thinking about, and sharing is around how you manage that governance. It's interesting. Earlier this year, we released our DX Trends report, and one of the points in that was around kind of professional independence and the fact that AI and just technology, the advancements in technology in general, are offering people this opportunity for greater professional independence in the marketing and digital space. So there's got to be the guardrails around it. There's got to be the governance around it to make sure that you're not just saying to people, go off and use whatever tech you want and go for gold, you're on your own, but making sure that there is a kind of controlled approach to that. So I'm just interested in hearing how you manage those sort of digital standards in that environment where people do want that independence to some extent, and they can see it. They feel like they can touch it because they can see the tools that they could be using, but you need to bring in that sort of governance to make sure that it's all within those guardrails.
I will say there's a lot of Canadian legislation in place that keeps us in, an environment where we have to be mindful. So, for example, from a privacy and security perspective, we can only use our approved AI tools. So our IT department has to vet tools that we might use and consider how much of a risk they pose from a privacy and security perspective. So we only have a small number of tools that are approved. That said, we also recognize that people use a much larger number of tools. They're using tools that haven't been approved. That's something to consider as well. I think this is an area that's really evolving, though, because I think we also need to think about, from a privacy and security perspective, there's two sides to this. We want to protect our data, and we want to be considerate of making sure that, we're thinking about how we need to be sensitive about how our data might be shared, but we also want to make sure that our data, our authoritative data, is accessible in the grand scheme of
Yes.
So these are conversations that are in progress, and I think that they need to happen. I think we're in a transition mode right now. We're thinking about who are the players in these discussions. How are we going to come up with this extended governance? Because one of the things we want to think about is we don't want to start with new governance that's just for AI. What are our best practices at our foundation? What are we trying to provide here in terms of what a great experience is, and how does AI fit into that conversation, so that we don't have best practices just for AI and governance just for AI, but we're thinking about our digital space as a whole, and how should we create content, whether it's manually created or whether it's created using AI. So I think that partially answers your question, because we are helping and guiding people to use AI by building off of our existing standards. And we're reminding people that our standards for are building good content, making it user friendly, making it accessible and inclusive, making sure it protects people's privacy. That all relates to AI as well. And I think it's been really helpful for us to be able to have that foundation to build off of, because we had existing awareness and buy-in in our community. We don't have to educate people from, the ground up in terms of what does it need to be accessible and inclusive. So yeah, I think that's how we're doing that, approaching that.
I think it's a really good point, because I think, who knows where things are going to go. No one saw AI accelerating at the rate that it did. No one could have predicted that. Well, very few people, probably some. You have no idea in the next year what things are going to look like and whether or not you're going to need to have a new way of governing things. And therefore, you want to be able to be building on the governance frameworks that you've already got and bringing in things like AI or new technologies or whatever it is, new ways of thinking, that weaving that into it rather than, as you say, sort of bolting it on as a whole new piece of governance. We can add this conversation or any conversation these days without talking about AI. But that is really just the latest sort of digital evolution. And again, given that you've been working in this space for so long, you must have seen a huge number of different digital evolutions or digital changes. And what have been some of the sort of main standout ones for you? And how in handling those have you kind of learned to handle anything new, I guess, that arises, like AI?
I guess if I think about some of the standout ones, I think our growing awareness of user experience, best practices, and putting users first. I think that was probably one of the big ones that stands out. Also, the introduction of social media. Soon after I started working in higher education in 2002, a couple of the universities that I worked at, I created their first Facebook pages and their Twitter feeds or their Twitter accounts. And there were a lot of conversations at that time, because I was also not just in web, but I was also working in communications and media. Concerns about people losing their jobs, journalists, for example, but just people that were creating media content in general, and what impact social media would have on that. And I see similarities with impacts of AI these days, concerns about people losing their jobs and how things are going to change. I think in terms of those similarities, I remember being in a conference presentation. There's a conference called SIGGRAPH, and there's a lot of people that participate at the conference that are in the film industry and digital graphics industry. And there were, for some reason that year, there were people that had come out from different media outlets who were there talking about their concerns losing their jobs. I remember the New York Times was there, LA Times was there, and the conference was taking place in LA. And it was this kind of, I guess, support group of all these journalists that had come out who were talking about their fears over impacts of social media and that people were losing their jobs. And I remember somebody standing up and saying, this isn't the end of content, online content. It's just that none of us have figured this out yet. But content online and our media outlets is going to continue. And one day we're going to be able to figure this out in a way that it can be monetized and it'll support itself. And I think I'm just starting to see that now. I mean, these outlets have continued, but I'm seeing that they're coming up with ways to monetize the work that they do and support. And maybe that will perhaps, create stability in their environments. But I see similar concern about the impacts that AI is going to have, and maybe that it's going to have a negative impact on the quality of our content. That's a possibility. Those are things that could happen. But I'll say one of the things that I wished had happened, and I can see now, is that those people in that room, I wish that they had become involved in social media and tried to influence how it grew. And maybe at this point, if they had become involved, then we would have better quality. Now with AI, I feel that there are people that are kind of trying to stay away from the conversation, and I wish they would be involved in the conversation, because they are people that could influence the decisions that we're making right now in positive ways. If AI is going to go in a positive direction, then you, as a person who is aware of best practices and can influence best practices, you need to be involved in this discussion. And I really wish that I see more of that. And I think about that when I think about how all of that played out with social media back in the day, that, yeah, things could have gone differently there. And maybe social media would be better than what it is right now. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And yeah, I come from a public relations background. And so, yeah, I saw that change myself as well
Well,
from the PR side of things, the diminishing editorial teams and the threat that they felt from social media presence. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think and it is the same that the people who are the kind of, who are reluctant, I guess, to get on board with AI are the people who they're reluctant to get on board with it because they're experts in their field and they don't want it to almost be taken over by technology, and they feel like they should still own that. But in owning that, they've almost got like a responsibility to make sure that AI is going to stick around. There's no getting rid of it. So they've got a responsibility to make sure that it's trained up in the right way, I guess, to actually use their expertise. And going back as well to a point that you made before around kind of accessibility and standards like that. Again, that's something that we've been talking about a lot at Squids around the accessibility of information being beyond, WCAG standards. But the fact that if you're producing the right content and it's then being found by things like the AI platforms that people are now using to research and to find information, then your good content is inherently more accessible. And so that the accessibility of the content on your website, of your digital experiences, has actually never been more important, because it's not just you delivering that information to the end user. It is the AI platforms that are pulling that information out. So I just think it's a fascinating conversation that we could probably talk about for hours, but maybe it's a whole different webinar for another time. And I think as well, the thing that's coming up a lot when you're talking is, everything really comes back to that audience and user experience and how you can best reach people in the best places. How do you think the way that you think about audiences from a digital perspective, has changed over time? And again, were there any sort of defining moments that changed how you thought about reaching those audiences?
I guess through most of my career, I've worked in higher education. So the audience to me has, throughout most of my career, been students. And I think I have, throughout my career, looked for opportunities to continue to work with and interact with students, even if that maybe isn't something that's part of my official job. But I do feel that now in my position at McGill, I've been able to create more successful, structured opportunities for students to influence the work that we do. And I think one of the most recent examples of that I am so happy with is our student usability panel. I recruited a panel of students who have agreed to work with us over a 2-year period and to provide insights and input in our projects that can span more long-term studies. And I feel like, and we also have the opportunity in putting this committee together, this panel together, to create a group of students that has balanced representation from our community. So we've looked to include strong representation from different segments of our audience that we want to make sure can influence the decisions that we make. So that kind of more, I think, mature, kind of nuanced kind of structure. In the past, I would have had conducted usability tests, worked with students on focus groups, or, invited students or recruited students to come work on our team as work study students. I think those are all really good things to do, and those are things that I continue to do. But thinking about ways to set up more structured kind of inputs that the students can have, and the ways they can influence our work in more official ways, I think is something that I am really happy that is something that I've been able to work on. So
Yeah, so really bringing the audience in. So again, yeah, for you being in the higher education space, the students are always the end user, your kind of primary end user. But I guess you can apply that theory to any industry. It's just about making sure that the customer that you're trying to reach at the end of your on the other side of that digital experience, you really truly understand them, and it goes beyond just the kind of the desk research. It's actually about making sure they're fully absorbed in what you're doing and having a kind of voice in how you change that or evolve that. Is there anything that's, I guess, either coming out of that or that you've noticed separately, sort of any emerging trends that you're keeping an eye on and you're wanting to advise your team on and the university on being across in the near future? I was going to say beyond AI, but AI is obviously inevitably one of them.
well, we had a conversation about this just today, because I think a lot of universities are looking at evolving their processes and making them more efficient, working more successfully cross-departmentally, for example. So I think for me, and it's the input that I brought to this conversation, was to make sure that those changes that we're talking about and that we're putting in place have involves the community in some way, because I feel that that is a way to get buy-in and a way to ensure progress with whatever different initiatives or new projects you're working on. If you can involve users in a community way, if you can create a sense of community around what you're trying to accomplish, that's going to go a long way in pushing your initiative forward. I really feel like that's a big thing to consider. I know there's a lot of things that we're talking about today
Yeah,
I make it
so
feel that we're taking the human side of it, the community side of it out of it. But I really feel like we should double down in this moment on that aspect of the work that we do. So
we could talk forever, but we'll have to wrap it up at some point, sadly. But going back, obviously, you've been in higher education for so long, and actually, all of the conversations I have with higher education professionals, everyone kind of says, in one way or another, once you're in it, and you love it, and you don't want to leave it. And obviously, you have been in it for quite some time. So, what do you think it is about higher education that's kind of kept you in that industry for all of these years?
for me, it's definitely the students. Having worked in universities for 20 years now, I've seen the students that I've worked with at the beginning of my career have gone on to do amazing things, to win awards, and to feel that I had some influence in the path that they took or the decisions that they made or where they've gone in their careers is so meaningful to me. There's nothing that compares to it. And to be able to continue to have that in my career, I think is the thing that I love about working in higher education.
Feel like I could probably guess the answer to this, but I won't. In terms of there being a sort of a through line in your career through everything that you've done, and I guess, not necessarily just in higher education, but from the very beginning, what has been the kind of common theme? And if it is it something that's maybe surprised you in terms of, yeah, the thing that's kind of been consistent in every role that you've gone through?
I do look back to my early days, and I felt like at the beginning, many of the roles that I took on were very customer service oriented. And I had customer service in my titles at the beginning of my career in some aspect. And I do feel like now to this point, I still feel very much like I'm in service of the people that use the tools that I work on. And I think that that's the common thread for me, is to help people use our tools and to do the things they need to do, and to make sure that they're as successful as they need to be at being able to do the things that they need to do. So yeah, that's what I'd say would be the common thread.
I love that. And actually, for what it's worth, my guess would have been that the common thread has been keeping the customer and the community, I guess, as a whole at the center of everything that you're doing, albeit obviously from a digitally driven perspective. When we've chatted before this call, I mentioned that actually it aligns so nicely to how we operate at Squiz. So our mission at Squiz is to create services online that improve lives offline. So it's that real recognition of the fact that yes, you're creating something digital, but actually the people that you're creating it for, it means something big for them offline. So if it's a student who is trying to find the right degree to make sure that they go in the right direction that they want to go in, or if we're working with a government agency and it's a citizen trying to find the right service to be able to reach whatever end goal it is that they're trying to do, there's ultimately a bigger picture beyond the website interface or the digital interface that they're interacting with. And so, yeah, when we've talked about that in the past, I love that synergy. So on a very final question, this podcast is really all about giving people access to the leaders who are at the forefront of everything digital these days, having to get their head around things, having to keep pivoting and moving at the rate of change that we're seeing. But you have a really interesting story to tell from all the lessons that you've learned over the years and the career path that you've taken. So if you were to give anyone any advice who's coming up the ranks now about how to tackle this sort of career, what would that be?
I feel like things are changing right now, and they're shifting. I mean, one of the things that I think has served me well throughout my career is always being interested in and curious and adventurous, and not to be afraid to try new things. I think you need to be comfortable failing at things. And maybe that's what I would say. I do feel that I've had some success in my career, but I have had plenty of failure too. That is something that if you're working in this industry, you need to be comfortable with. Not everything is going to be a success. I feel that I've made some headway in terms of governance, establishing governance at McGill, but there is no 100% good governance in any higher education institution. Our sites will never be completely aligned with our standards, and that's okay. We should still strive for that, and we should try to accomplish that, but we should be comfortable knowing that, you need to do the best that you can do and not to be afraid to fail, to try different things and, strive for those things, but be comfortable knowing that you are just going to do the best job that you can do.
Love that. And I think there's no other way you can be these days. You've got to be ready to test and learn and pivot and adapt and just keep trying new things, to your point, and be kind of comfortable being uncomfortable, I suppose, and not being 100% sure of the end outcome, because you'll never know unless you don't give it a go. Well, thank you so much, Joyce. It's been so cool to chat to you. And as I say, I think we could probably chat for a few more hours. We'll let you go. And again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lorna. I really enjoyed this experience. It's been great.